So welcome, everybody. I'm joined today by Geoffrey Harris and Steve Harris. And as you can guess, they're brothers. And, you know, we've had this on our mind is how do you change the world with God's love? So Geoffrey, how do we do that?
Okay, thank you, Alvin. Appreciate you being here with us this morning and guiding us along. There's a lot of racial unrest in America now, and a lot of racial injustice really is a hot topic. And Steve shared with me a very interesting story recently about 3 kinds of prejudice, and it was really interesting and informative to me. Steve is my brother. He's a pastor. He works leading pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention in North Carolina. He works with associational leaders and pastors there. And Steve, I just wanted to get I enjoyed that conversation with you, and I just wanted to get your input on that, share that story with us. Would you do that?
Yeah. I have a great friend by the name of Paul Burleson. Paul was my pastor when I was in seminary many years ago, but we have stayed in touch. We have a reunion for the seminary students that were at our church at that time. We've been doing this reunion every other summer for many years now. So we've stayed in touch, and Paul is an incredible, prolific writer. I would encourage you to check him out on Facebook, Paul Burleson. But he's writing a several-part series on racism right now, and the first one was just riveting. He defined 3 kinds of racism. Intentional racism, which would be something like the Ku Klux Klan, people who are just intentionally racist. They know they're racist, they're prejudiced, they don't care, white supremacists, that kind of thing. And then there is institutional racism. We see it, maybe that's not quite so overt, but we see it in our institutions, government, education, the business world, economics, the entertainment industry, all those kinds of things. There's institutional racism. But then there's a third kind that really gripped me, and that's what he called unintentional racism. We don't even realize the prejudices that are deep in our heart. We think that we're not racist at all, but then things start slipping out, and all of a sudden we realize, oh, I didn't even realize that was there. So that's those 3 kinds. I can share some illustrations because I was deeply convicted about unintentional racism.
Good. That's good. That's interesting. Give us some examples there.
Well, in terms of intentional racism, you know, Geoffrey, you and I grew up in the South. And we grew up in a turbulent time, and we grew up in a home, a loving Christian home. Our dad was an incredible Christian man. He grew up on a farm, a tobacco farm down in the eastern part of the coast, and they had African-American tenant farmers that lived on their farm and worked with them in tobacco. And, you know, they paid them, but there was just some kind of a little bit of holdover there from the attitudes of the old South slavery, you know, where there was a sense of superiority. And, you know, I think Dad brought a little bit of that into our family. And then when I was growing up, I hate to admit that I didn't realize until I was probably in high school that that the South was kind of on the wrong side of the Civil War. Anyway, those were some things. And then I remember jokes, ethnic jokes, and I told them myself, and I thought it was just kind of funny. And so there was probably a little bit of intentional racism there, but God really began doing a work in me, and I've tried ever since I was convicted of it to get rid of that. But then the unintentional racism is where I've really been convicted. My friend Paul told a story about preaching a message one time, and he just shared a story about this professional athletic team that was coming through the airport where he was, and there were a bunch of groupies around them. Well, the athletes got on the airplane, the groupies were left behind, and there was a young lady that just kind of was part of that group, but she sat down by herself. And he told the story of how he went up to this young African-American lady and he shared the gospel with her. Well, after the sermon, one of his friends who was African-American came and sat down and said, I know that you're not racist. I know that you don't intend to be racist. But he said, I think you expressed some unintentional racism in your message today. He said, how in the world did I do that? And he said, well, you told us that you sat down and shared the gospel with a young African-American lady. He said, if she had been a Caucasian, would you have said, I sat down and shared the gospel with a Caucasian lady? Probably not. So why did you have to point out that she was African-American? And he was deeply convicted all of a sudden, just bam, just like that. Well, as I read that post, I realized some unintentional racism that came out in one of my sermons. I was telling about what it means to be in Christ, the protection that we have being in Christ. And I just used an illustration. I said, you know how in these old Western movies, they circle the wagon train and the Indians come around the wagon train and they're hooping and hollering and they're shooting bows and arrows at the people as they're behind the wagon wheels and trying to protect themselves. I said, well, when you're in Christ, it's like you're in an army tank and the Indians are circling the army tank and they're shooting at you with their arrows, but you don't have any concern at all because you know those arrows are just going to bounce off of the tank. Well, when I finished the message, I was confronted by a high school student, and they said, I was deeply offended by your illustration. Number one, they don't want you to call them Indians. They're not from India. They want to be called Native Americans. And number two, you shared a caricature of Native Americans whooping and hollering and shooting arrows at people. And that was offensive too. And I think it would be offensive to them if they heard you share that. Well, you know, I kind of bristled at that and thought, quit being such a snowflake sensitive millennial, you know, but I had to stop and really listen. And I think every person, you know, one of the tenets of our natural discipleship is that every person is created in the image of God and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And I think that can start with a place of calling them what they want to be called. If they don't want to be called Indians, we don't need to call them Indians. You know, we need to call them what they want to be called and respect them in that way. And so that's a couple of examples of unintentional racism.
That's really good. Steve, this series is called Lead with Love. And in your booklet, you wrote a booklet called Steps to Knowing God. You asked this question. What do you think about loving God and loving people as the highest purpose for your life? Why does love need to be the highest purpose of a leader's life, do you think?
Well, first of all, it's an expression of the nature of God. You know, 1 John says, God is love, period. That's his nature. And as a Christian, we want to become more like Christ. And so if we want to become more like Christ, then love has to be our highest goal. That's underlined and underscored over and over again. The great commandment, love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That's my number one highest purpose in life. Every morning when I wake up, my life is very simple. All I have to answer the question is, God, how do you want me to love you today? And how do you want me to love the people around me?
That's good. That's good. Well, you know, God's ultimate purpose in coming here, sending his son here, was love. His purpose should become our purpose. And I think, you know, a lot of people are looking for purpose in their life. How many times have we all encountered people, or even, you know, had seasons in our own life where we felt like, you know, we weren't sure exactly what our purpose was? And a lot of people wrestle and grapple with that question. Well, you know, you don't have to go any further than this to really understand if God's purpose is love, our purpose ought to be love too. So we can express that from the moment we get up in the morning till we lay our head on the pillow at night. Amen. Who did we encounter that day? How well did we love them? You know, we can even measure it on a scale of 1 to 10, you know? So, love, we do need to lead with love.
Yeah.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you was about, we talk about in our natural discipleship training about initiating respectful dialogues. And we train our students, you know, how do you begin a conversation with somebody about spiritual things, but it's natural, it's not forced, it's not awkward and weird. And we've, you know, many have been through trainings like we have, you know, where it's really, people do force it, and it always feels wrong. At least it has for me. So how do we start and initiate a respectful dialogue, especially when we're talking about a sensitive subject like racism? It's one of those things like sharing the gospel. You don't just kind of come up and blurt out a question about racism. Any suggestions about how we do that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think when it comes to racism, one thing we need to keep in mind is that the people who are most qualified to understand and explain racism are the people who have experienced it. And so we're at a disadvantage as Caucasians if we have not experienced racism. I've really heard illustrations of Caucasians and, you know, that have experienced racism, kind of reverse racism, if you call it, but not really, not much. And so that's why it is absolutely essential that we humble ourselves and ask God to clear our hearts of our preconceived ideas and learn how to listen to our African-American friends. And so the key to that is asking good questions. You know, Proverbs 20 says, "Deep are the purposes of a man's heart, but a man of understanding can draw them out." And that's what we need to do. And the only way to draw out what is in a person's heart is by asking good questions. And so the questions that I'm asking, I participated in a multiracial worship service Sunday morning. I've got African-American friends, and I try to humble myself and say, listen, I know how much you've been hurt in your life. Yes, we've made some progress, but we've got a long ways to go. Please help me understand what it's like to experience racism and what you feel like I personally could do about it. And so those are questions that I think we just have to ask. I'm setting up a luncheon right now with another white pastor and 2 black pastors. And I already told him yesterday, I said, when we get together with them, we need to shut our mouths and ask a few questions and just listen.
That's good. That's really, really good. I was thinking through this as I was contemplating our time together, and we've always talked about that we need to make disciples of Christ in the context of relationships. You know, Jesus didn't just force his message on people. He connected with them relationally. And love begins with leading with love, and love begins with a relationship. And as we reach out to people, instead of just trying to get our message across, as we reach out to people where they are, as you suggested, and love them where they are, and cultivate that relationship, then there are going to be natural opportunities that will come up in that relationship where you can ask these deeper questions at a personal level. You know, I was thinking about, you know, I have a friend who's African American that I'm going to be interviewing in our second tape in this series, and I asked him if he had a story that he would share about how racism has been hurtful to him, and that was the question that I introduced racism with him, because
really good question.
Because it was about him, it was about his experience, and it wasn't an intimidating question that he thought I already had an answer to. I think he understood I was genuinely wanting to hear from his perspective and learn from him. So asking questions is really key in developing relationships. Good questions. Asking good questions with the right timing is really key in the whole area of relationships and dealing with the issues of racism. Any other comments, you or Alvin? Do you have anything you would like to add to what we're talking about?
Steve, his final point about racism, unintentional racism. I heard it said, I mean, that's a big point. It's important. It hits a nerve in me. And I heard it said just a little bit differently on a podcast yesterday, and that is we all have blind spots.
Yep.
The scary thing about that, as a white man, I have blind spots, and I don't know what I don't know, and I don't see what I don't see. And Geoffrey, you and I have been talking about this. This is the time to step up. Invite a friend to lunch, invite a friend to coffee, ask questions, be quiet, and listen. Because we all have those blind spots. I have so many I'm beginning to see in the last week or two.
Well, I think we tend to look for people to reinforce our own preconceived ideas. And one thing I'm seeing in terms of racism, I'm seeing two big extremes right now. One extreme is what you're seeing in the streets, the protests, and not even the protests. We have a constitutional right to protest. And we've seen great reforms come about through peaceful protests. But then you've got those on the outside, the Antifa, that are into violent protest, into looting and vandalism and even injury and murder. Obviously, that's an extreme position. But they're screaming. And I believe we're going to see police reform. We're going to see different kinds of reform, institutional reform. We're going to see that come out of this. But then there's another extreme. And that is even Black columnists and Black speakers like Candace Owens and people like that. They, what I'm hearing on that end is, you know, if you're a Caucasian and you don't have racism in your heart, you don't owe anybody an apology. African Americans have put themselves up as victims all these years. They need to stop acting like victims. They need to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, get a good education, speak good English, get into society, work hard, and make something out of yourself and quit making excuses for yourself. Now, that really resonates with a certain degree of Blacks and African Americans. It resonates with a lot of whites and Caucasians. And I think there's a degree of truth to that. You're not going to pull yourself up by always seeing yourself as a victim. But I believe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. There's a radical middle there where, yes, African Americans do need to take responsibility for themselves. Don't make excuses. When you get pulled over by a policeman, you show them respect. Put your hands up. There's an African American sheriff out west that did a video on how an African American young man can respond if he's pulled over by the police. You put your hands up, let them see your hands. Everything you say, you qualify with yes, sir, officer. And you do exactly what they tell you to do. Because if you don't, they are bound. They have to get control, and they will do whatever they have to do to get you under control, even if it means injuring you. That happened to my son. He was on his way out to California, got pulled over in Oklahoma by an unmarked police car. The man got out, came up to his window, he rolled his window down, and Luke knew that he hadn't done anything wrong, but he told him to get out of the car. And he said, "I'm uncomfortable getting out of the car." And he grabbed his arm, and I mean, he just about pulled it out of the socket. He was screaming. It hurt so bad. His shoulder and his chest was black and blue for 2 months after that. And the reason is because he didn't do what that officer told him to do. And so I told him, I said, "Luke, in the future, if you get pulled over, you do exactly what they tell you to do. And you show the ultimate respect for them because they have to get control. And so that's the kind of thing that we show respect. But on the other hand, African Americans are at a disadvantage. There is prejudice, there is racism. We need to come alongside of them and not give them a handout necessarily, but give them a hand up and give them opportunities and work with them and disciple them and encourage them and help lift them up and level the playing field by showing them respect and working together with them. That's where that middle radical ground is calling them to responsibility and at the same time giving them the respect and help and encouragement that they need to level the playing field.
You know, Steve.
That's right. Excuse me, go ahead.
I heard this in an interview in a podcast yesterday, and I thought it was, I'm so glad I watched, so glad I listened, but pastor was interviewing 3 black members in the church, and he asked, you know, where have you seen or experienced this unintentional racism? What's my blind spot? And he said, well, Pastor, you're really good at loving me in the 4 corners of the church. But where you're not really good is loving me when you see me in the mall. And I'm a firm believer that people of faith, families of faith, you must have these conversations with your children and grandchildren. And we must be seen as leading from the front by example and expressing love, regardless of how awkward it is.
Yeah,
and
that's so true.
Take the lead. We must take the lead. And if we don't, and Geoffrey, you and I have talked about this often, we will be known for our silence.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Geoffrey. It all revolves around relationship. And it's one thing to do what I might call drive-by ministry. You know, you drive by ministry to the poor. You throw them a bag of food. You throw them some clothes. Let them come to the clothes closet. Give them some food, but you don't get involved in their lives. And I heard, you know, Jesus said, I came to preach the gospel to the poor. And so as you look at that, and I heard one person that was involved in a ministry like this, and she said, if you're not willing to invest 20 years in a relationship with someone who's living in poverty, then don't waste your time. And I think that's a little bit extravagant, extreme, but the idea is, are you willing to build a relationship with someone who's in poverty? Are you willing to build an actual friendship and relationship with someone of another ethnic background and invest in them intentionally? Bring them into your home, have dinner together, be one of those 2 o'clock in the morning friends that they will call if they're in trouble at 2 o'clock in the morning.
I know that's good, Steve. I know I've seen a lot on social media of people that are videographers that are going to public or governmental facilities and police areas and getting on a neutral sidewalk somewhere and taking videos and being confronted by police, and they're schooling them on their constitutional rights. You know, I have a right to be here. I have a right to take videos legally and lawfully. I don't have to give you my name. I don't have to explain myself why I'm here. This is my right. I'm on a public access, and they are trying to expose officers who tried to go across the line and violating their constitutional rights. And as I've watched that, I've realized, that it's not done in a spirit of love at all. It's done in a spirit of, you've been abusing us, you've been telling us, you've been stepping over the line in your police authority for years and years and years, and I'm going to school you on what the Constitution says. And so it still ends up being a combative situation on both sides. And the point of this series is, as leaders, we need to lead with love. We can take those steps to make our point and so forth, but bottom line, we need to do it in the context of love and caring about them and their safety, and being interested in each other and connecting with each other. God had a reason why he made the great commandment to love him and love others. And it was for our protection. And when we step outside of his guidelines and his boundaries, that's when we start having conflict and differing opinions. And it's not, what we're sharing is not being offered in a spirit of love. And that's why our country is so polarized, I believe, like it is right now, is because it's all about us and our perspective. So this has been a great conversation today, to be able to just talk about what does love have to do with racism? It has a whole lot to do with it. And we can't control what other people say, what other people do, but we can control what we do and what we say and the spirit in which we share it. So my challenge to our leaders here and in internationally is that we need to be leading with love. We need to be thinking about how can I approach this topic from the context of love and have the other person's interest at heart before I just throw out hard questions that are going to maybe offend other people. Steve, I really enjoyed in my ministry using the process of disciple making that you wrote called Natural Discipleship, and I've had the pleasure and joy of sharing it with people all over the world, and especially in Africa. In our third video in this series, I'm going to be interviewing our national African leaders and getting their understanding and perspective on racism and what it is like there and what they've had to deal with, all with the idea of sharing this underlying principle is that God has called us to lead with love. So I really appreciate you writing that and the joy I've had to share it with a lot of people. I also want to encourage people who are listening to this that they can get a free copy of your series called Natural Discipleship by contacting us at powerpointministries.com. If you go there to our website, on the front page, there's a place where you can actually sign up and we will send you a free PDF copy of his 97-page document on natural discipleship. We'd love for you to do that, and I look forward to hearing from anyone who would like a free copy of that. So anything else you need to say, Alvin, before we close?
Yes, I have something I need to say. You know, if we are going to lead from the front by example, another way to make this happen is grab this video, share it. We all know how social media works. We all know how quickly a message can be shared from phone to phone. Grab this and share it. That would be one small step in the right direction of leading by example.
Good. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you today, and we look forward to sharing the next 2 videos with you. Watch for them.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.